November 15th, 1973, Royal Albert Hall, London. The host walked onto the stage and announced with complete indifference, "And finally we have some rock group called Queen." The audience laughed. Not with them, at them. Many had already started leaving. But what happened in the next 8 minutes made David Bowie stop packing his equipment, Elton John rush out from his dressing room, and 2,800 people who had never heard of Queen transform from dismissive laughter into thunderous screaming. Because Freddie Mercury was about to prove that sometimes the greatest performances don't come from the famous and established, they come from the rejected and desperate who have absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to prove. This isn't just a story about a band getting their big break. This is about the exact moment when Farouk Bulsara died and Freddie Mercury was born. When four struggling outsiders who had been told no by every record label in London walked onto Britain's most prestigious stage as nobodies and walked off 8 minutes later as legends. But to understand why those 8 minutes shattered every expectation, you need to know what brought them to that stage in the first place. 6 months of brutal rejection, crushing poverty, and the kind of burning determination that only comes from people who refuse to accept that they don't belong. 6 months earlier, Queen didn't even exist as we know them today. They were the remnants of a failed band called Smile, three talented musicians watching their dreams crumble while working day jobs they hated. Brian May had spent years building his homemade guitar, the Red Special, crafted from an old fireplace mantel with his father. Roger Taylor had given up dental school to chase music. John Deacon was a brilliant engineering student who saw something special in this group's potential. And then there was Farouk Bulsara, a Zanzibar-born art student with a gap-toothed smile and a voice that could shatter glass. When Tim Staffel left Smile to join Humpy Bong, most people expected the band to dissolve. Instead, Farouk stepped forward with an audacity that bordered on madness. "I'll be your singer," he announced despite having no formal vocal training. "But we're changing the name. We're going to be called Queen." The other three looked at this theatrical art student with his flowing scarves and dramatic gestures. He was everything the British rock scene wasn't supposed to embrace. Too foreign, too flamboyant, too much. But when he opened his mouth and sang, something magical happened. His voice had a range that seemed impossible, 4 octaves of pure power that could whisper secrets or command armies. The next 6 months were a masterclass in rejection and resilience. Queen took their demos to every record label in London, and every record label in London said no. EMI told them their music was too complex for radio. Decca Records called their harmonies uncommercial. Columbia suggested they find a new singer, someone less theatrical. Each rejection stung, but each rejection also strengthened their resolve. They were living in a cramped flat in London, sharing expenses, eating beans on toast for dinner 3 nights a week because it was all they could afford. Brian May was supposed to be completing his doctorate in astrophysics. Instead, he was playing guitar in dingy clubs where the audience talked through their entire set. Roger Taylor had walked away from a guaranteed career in dentistry to drum for a band that couldn't afford to pay for rehearsal space. And Freddie Mercury was working at a second-hand clothes shop in Kensington Market, selling vintage scarves and military jackets to hippies and art students, all while knowing he had the voice to fill stadiums. In late October 1973, after their latest round of record label rejections, the four members of Queen sat in their flat wondering if they should give up. They had enough money for maybe one more month of expenses. After that, they would have to make the devastating choice between their dreams and survival. That's when the phone rang with an opportunity that seemed almost too good to be true. Margaret Foster was organizing a charity concert at the Royal Albert Hall to benefit music education programs. The guest list read like a who's who of British entertainment. Elton John, David Bowie, Rod Stewart, all the established stars who could guarantee ticket sales and wealthy donations. This was an evening for the proven, the reliable, the safe. But there had been a last-minute cancellation, and they needed another act to fill the slot. Margaret's assistant had heard Queen perform at a small club and suggested them for the opening. When Margaret called the record companies asking about Queen, most had never heard of them. The few who had described them as that theatrical rock group or the band with the flamboyant singer. Margaret had never heard their music. When she asked her husband about Queen, he shrugged and said, they were some rock group that young people listened to, not really suitable for this kind of sophisticated evening, but if they're available, why not? The offer came with conditions that would have insulted established artists. Queen would perform first before the main attractions. They would get 8 minutes maximum. They would receive no payment beyond covering their travel expenses. They would have no rehearsal time on the actual stage because the schedule was too tight. 8 minutes, no money, no rehearsal, performing before an audience that had never heard of them and probably wouldn't care to remember them afterward. Brian May brought this information back to the band. Roger's first reaction was anger. 8 minutes was an afterthought, a warm-up act. John analyzed it practically, but it's the Royal Albert Hall, television coverage, radio broadcast. That's worth more than any payment. Freddie listened to both perspectives, then made the decision that would define their future. We take it, he said with quiet intensity, and we make those 8 minutes so incredible that nobody will ever forget them. The 3 weeks leading up to the concert became an obsession. Queen rehearsed constantly, refining every note, every harmony, every movement. They couldn't afford professional rehearsal space, so they practiced wherever they could find room. Abandoned warehouses, empty garages, late at night in their flat, trying to keep the volume down so neighbors wouldn't complain. They chose their set list carefully. 8 minutes meant roughly 2 songs. But which 2? They needed something that would immediately grab attention, something that showcased all 4 members, something undeniably Queen. During this period, Freddie's preparation bordered on obsession. He practiced his stage movements for hours in front of mirrors, experimenting with different ways to command attention. He designed his outfit with meticulous care, knowing visual impact would be crucial. Most importantly, he worked on his performance persona, finding ways to channel his natural theatricality into something powerful rather than pretentious. November 15th, 1973, the day of the concert, Queen arrived at the Royal Albert Hall 6 hours before showtime, carrying their instruments and what little equipment they owned. They were directed to use the service entrance while the established acts used the main artist entrance. Their dressing room was actually a converted storage closet near the building service areas, nowhere near the proper dressing rooms where Elton John and David Bowie prepared. They didn't complain. They set up their instruments, checked their tuning, and tried to stay focused despite the chaos around them. Throughout the afternoon, they caught glimpses of the other performers. Elton John walked past their door once, resplendent in his signature, outrageous costume, and gave them a friendly nod without stopping to talk. David Bowie moved through the backstage area like a ghost, ethereal and untouchable in his Ziggy Stardust phase. Rod Stewart was surrounded by his entourage, loud and confident, clearly in his element. These weren't enemies, but they were operating in a different league entirely, and Queen was trying to break into that league with nothing but talent, ambition, and 8 minutes of stage time. The concert began at 7 o'clock. Queen could hear everything through the walls. Elton John's performance was masterful, his voice soaring over intricate piano arrangements that had the audience mesmerized. The applause was thunderous, lasting several minutes. Rod Stewart brought raw energy that made the building shake with excitement. David Bowie was transcendent, otherworldly, performing as if he had descended from another planet to grace mere mortals with his presence. As each act finished, the bar for the next performer rose higher. By the time the evening's main performances were complete, the audience was in a state of euphoric satisfaction. They had seen 3 masters at work. They were ready to leave happy, fulfilled, complete. And then there was Queen, the unknown band that nobody had come to see. At 10:30, a production assistant knocked on their storage room door. "You're up in 5 minutes." The 4 members of Queen stood, gathered their instruments, and took deep breaths. As they walked toward the stage through the backstage corridors, they passed Margaret Foster talking to the evening's host about the final act. After Lord Pemberton finishes his remarks about the charity's impact, we'll have Queen perform, Margaret said matter-of-factly. Who? The host sounded genuinely confused. Queen, the rock band. They're new, young. My assistant insisted we include them. A pause. Are they any good? I have no idea, but they're performing for free, so it costs us nothing. Give them their few minutes, then we'll move on to the auction. That's where the real money gets raised anyway. How long should I introduce them? Just say the name. Keep it brief. Most of our guests won't know who they are anyway. Let's not make a fuss. Light laughter. Should be interesting to see how rock music goes over with this crowd. It probably won't, but we needed to fill time and they were available. Freddie heard every word. Instead of crushing his spirit, something extraordinary happened. His jaw tightened, his eyes hardened, and his entire posture changed. By the time they reached the stage entrance, Farouk Bulsara, the insecure art student, had vanished. In his place stood Freddie Mercury, a force of nature who was about to remind the world why true talent cannot be ignored. The host walked onto the stage to address an audience that was already gathering their coats and checking their watches. Many people had begun leaving after the main acts finished. Those who remained were making polite conversation, ready to give dutiful attention to whatever came next before heading home. And finally, the host announced with no enthusiasm whatsoever, we have a new group called Queen. That was it. No build-up, no context, no explanation, just the name delivered like an afterthought. The applause was polite but sparse, the kind you give because silence would be rude. Queen walked onto the stage. Four young men nobody recognized. Four musicians who had been dismissed, rejected, and ignored for months. Four artists who had exactly one chance to prove everyone wrong. Freddie Mercury approached the microphone. The stage lights hit him, and for a moment, he was blinded. But he didn't falter. He adjusted the microphone stand with deliberate precision, looked out at the audience of 2,800 faces, most already mentally checked out, and spoke with a confidence that seemed impossible given the circumstances. Good evening, we are Queen and we are here to rock you. Some people in the audience chuckled, not with them, at them. The presumption of this nobody making such a bold statement seemed almost charming in its naivety. But Freddie's expression didn't change. He turned to his bandmates, gave them a subtle nod, and they began to play. What happened next has been studied, analyzed, and celebrated for 5 decades. Brian May's opening guitar riff cut through the venue like lightning, not gentle, not tentative, aggressive, demanding immediate attention. Roger Taylor's drums entered like thunder, precise but overpowering. John Deacon's bass created a foundation that you felt in your chest rather than simply heard with your ears. And then Freddie Mercury began to sing. His voice was unlike anything that audience had ever experienced. It wasn't just powerful, it was 4 octaves of pure emotion. Rock and opera and soul and something entirely new, all combined into an instrument that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The conversations in the audience stopped mid-sentence. People who had been gathering their coats froze with arms half in sleeves. The BBC radio engineer who had been preparing to fade out for the news suddenly focused completely on his levels, realizing he was capturing something extraordinary. But Freddie wasn't just singing, he was performing with a presence that made the vast Royal Albert Hall feel intimate. He moved like a dancer, a fighter, a lover, and a prophet all at once. Every gesture was deliberate, every note was perfect, and every moment radiated an authority that commanded absolute attention. Behind him, Brian May's guitar work was revelation itself. The Red Special, built from fireplace wood and motorcycle valve springs, created sounds that seemed to come from another dimension. Roger Taylor's drumming was so precise it felt like he and the music were a single entity. John Deacon's bass held everything together with a steadiness that allowed the others to soar. The first song ended. For a moment, there was complete silence. 2,800 people sat stunned, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Then the applause started. Not polite applause, real applause, enthusiastic applause that grew louder with each second. People stood up. The television cameras captured faces in the audience showing genuine surprise and wonder. And Queen, without pausing, went directly into their second song. This one was even more ambitious, more complex, more impossible. And Freddie sang it like he was singing for his very soul because, in a way, he was. This was their chance, their one shot at proving they belonged on the same stage as legends. Brian May's guitar solo in the second song became the stuff of mythology. His fingers moved across the fretboard with speed and precision that defied belief while maintaining an emotional depth that reached into the hearts of everyone listening. The harmonies that would become Queen's signature sound, layered vocals that seemed to require a choir, came from just four voices blending in perfect synchronization. And Freddie Mercury was transcendent. He hit notes that shouldn't be possible for a human voice, held them longer than seemed physically feasible, and moved between registers with an ease that made it look effortless. He owned every inch of that stage, made eye contact with people throughout the audience, pointed at the television cameras as if challenging them to look away. When the second song ended, their 8 minutes were up, but the audience didn't care about schedules anymore. They erupted with an intensity that shook the building. People were on their feet screaming, demanding more, completely transformed from the politely bored crowd that had gathered their coats just minutes earlier. The host stood in the wings with his mouth hanging open. Margaret Foster looked like she had witnessed a miracle. Most incredibly, the established artists had stopped what they were doing to watch. Elton John had come out from his dressing room to see what the commotion was about. David Bowie stood at the side of the stage, his otherworldly composure replaced by genuine amazement. Rod Stewart had stopped packing his equipment and returned to listen, shaking his head in disbelief. Queen left the stage to applause that lasted nearly 10 minutes. They walked back to their converted storage room in complete shock. For several moments, none of them spoke. Finally, Roger Taylor laughed. Did that just happen? Brian May sat down heavily. I think it did. John Deacon smiled. We did it. We actually did it. And Freddie Mercury looked at himself in the small mirror. Hours earlier, he had seen a struggling musician hoping for a break. Now he saw something completely different. A star. Before they could pack their instruments, there was a knock on their door. It was a representative from EMG Records, the same label that had rejected them weeks earlier. He wanted to discuss a recording contract. Then a journalist from Melody Maker arrived. A television producer came next. The phone began ringing constantly with calls from people who had heard the radio broadcast. Who was this Queen band? Within a week, Queen had signed their first major recording contract. Within a month, their debut album was scheduled for release. Within a year, they were headlining tours across Europe. But it all traced back to that November night in 1973, to 8 minutes at the Royal Albert Hall, to a performance nobody wanted to see, but nobody could forget. Years later, Elton John called it one of the most impressive displays of pure talent I've ever witnessed. David Bowie described it as, the night I realized the music industry was about to change forever. Freddie would occasionally reference that night. We were the act nobody wanted, he would say, so we made damn sure everyone would remember us. The four members of Queen never forgot what that performance taught them. Success wasn't given, it was taken. Respect wasn't automatic, it was earned. The greatest performances came not from comfort and security, but from the burning need to prove everyone wrong. Today, when introducing new artists at the Royal Albert Hall, someone will occasionally say, this is the venue where unknowns became legends in 8 minutes. Because that's exactly what happened. Four musicians who had been rejected and ignored took 8 minutes of stage time and transformed them into eternity. They proved that talent combined with determination cannot be stopped, that one opportunity seized completely can change everything, that the greatest revenge against doubt isn't anger, it's excellence.